I am Davila LeBlanc, published author, because today my first book, Dark Transmissions, has just been launched. It's available for sale off the HarperCollins site and the Amazon, so I'll be leaving links in the description for people who are interested in purchasing it. And I'm really excited. This is the achievement of a life's goal, so I'm really happy about it, and I'm going to keep on producing these videos to engage with my readers and, offer these sort of semi-educational Q&As. So without further ado, I'm going to go on with this article that I wrote called Conflict, Escalation, Challenges, the Spices of Good Storytelling. I'm going to open with a really boring story. Once upon a time, there was a man who had no problems. He never faced any challenges and lived happily ever after. The end. Now, I think we can both agree that this story is far from being interesting or entertaining. In fact, if I were to compare this one-sentence story to a meal, I'd have to say it's probably the equivalent of a very overboiled potato, lacking in flavor and spice. So what spices do storytellers have at their disposal to heat up their tale? How can they excite their readers? Well, the easiest answer is as follows. The spices of good storytelling are conflict, escalation, and change. Now, I have to be very clear here that conflict in this context does not mean violence, although violence is often an easy conflict tool that many storytellers, myself included, will rely upon. No, conflict in this case is more akin to complications that our protagonist will face. Yes, conflict can be about the hero and the villain having an ultra-choreographed gunfight on a rooftop with helicopters shooting missiles at them, but that is not all that conflict can be. In fact, oftentimes, many films, shows, and yes, even books will throw in an action scene because the author is afraid of losing the audience. But conflict can also be about a jobless hero trying to find work. It can be about a person whose life is void of love, trying to find the Mr. or Miss Right. It can be the sickly patient trying to overcome their disease. It can be a single mother trying to raise a child on her own. It can be a man struggling to survive after a plane crash in the desert. It can be about a young farmer in a galaxy far away trying to defeat the Galactic Empire. What I mean to say with this is that conflict need not equate violence and vice versa. The greatest fight sequence in the world will mean nothing to a viewer or reader without context behind it. As a storyteller, it's our job to give the audience the context it needs so that they can be invested in whatever conflict you're presenting them with. Which leads us to escalation, a tool used by storytellers to raise the emotional stakes of the tale. We need the story's pace and stakes to escalate. There's always a need for complications to arise. This allows the audience to get emotionally invested in the story, which is why it is so important for writers to make it clear what the stakes in the story are. An audience member won't care about the hero defeating that generic mustache-twirling villain. They will, however, care if they know that said mustache-twirling villain has kidnapped the hero's friend, family, dog, car, Tesseract Cube, Infinity Gauntlet, whatever. You get the point. Why? Because now they know what is at stake, what the hero stands to lose or gain from overcoming the challenges and conflicts set before him or her. Let us imagine a detective, a protagonist, who is given a murder to investigate. Our protagonist has few clues to go off of and is probably being lied to by somebody. Enter our first series of complications and challenges to overcome. Let's set the stakes. Perhaps the victim in this case is a wealthy person, and our detective is facing pressure from those on top to solve this matter quickly and discreetly. Perhaps our detective's job or reputation is on the line. Maybe the detective knew the victim. Already, with these few sentences, we have the inkling of a story rife with potential conflict and challenges to overcome. We are aware of the stakes, and we are invested in knowing what is going to happen to our protagonist. Now, ideally in a story, the stakes should always be escalating. Each challenge the protagonist overcomes should lead to another greater complication to overcome. The important thing to remember here is that we don't ever leave the protagonist, or the audience for that matter, an opportunity to catch their breath until the story is done. Let's get back to our previously mentioned detective, who has just now, after looking into clues and leads and probably getting into a fistfight or two, overcome the challenge of finding out who the killer is. He or she should be faced with a further complication. Maybe the killer is protected by wealthy people and is untouchable. Does the detective let it go? Does the detective take the law into his or her own hands, exposing the truth regardless of the cost to him or herself? Maybe the killer is mentally handicapped and unaware of what he or she is doing. Can our detective truly convict this person? Maybe the killer is actually being set up, and our detective realizes he or she has been working for the bad guys the entire time. What does he or she do now? Do they dig deeper and risk being killed over this mystery? These are simple examples, and I could easily go on and on. Of course, this all leads to an incredible balancing act. Too much conflict, too much escalation, and our audience will begin to roll their eyes and go, yeah, right. Too little conflict and too little escalation, and our audience will yawn and fall asleep. Storytelling is always like a bit of a recipe. You don't want it too spicy, you don't want it too bland, you want it just right. Change is the final spice of the storyteller's rack, and it is an important one. Ideally, our protagonist should go through changes as the story plays itself out. Our sickly patient should get well. Our bitter, loveless single person should meet their soulmate as he or she becomes more likable. This is easily done by giving the protagonist personal challenges to overcome. If our detective starts out the story married to his job with a suffering family life, then by the end of the story, he or she should change, show up for their kid's softball game. If our detective starts out the story as an alcoholic, by the end of the tale, they should be giving up the bottle. These are very easy examples, once again. And as a storyteller, you can go as deep as you want with the changes or growth you will have your protagonist go through. Now, my personal note on violence and storytelling. Violence is a tool, something we can use to easily demonstrate conflict. However, in this day and age, many filmmakers and storytellers, and regretfully I am guilty of this in the past, have taken to thinking that violence equals conflict, conflict equals story, ergo violence equals story. This is simply not true. Once again, I have to mention that an action sequence without context is devoid of value, and worst of all, it makes said violence gratuitous and pointless. Old westerns and samurai films, and even the original Star Wars, did this right all the time. These storytellers knew what violence was a good tool for conflict, but they never just made films about killing and fighting. If two gunmen stared each other down and were about to draw, we needed to know who they were, what brought them to this point in time, and why they were shooting at each other. Some of the greatest samurai and western films have 2 action sequences during their 2 to 3 hour runtimes. What does this mean? It means yes, you can use violence in your tale, but if you're going to, make sure your audience knows the context of the violence. Use violence to show us how undesirable it is. Show us people getting hurt. Show us the consequence and impact of said violence. A hero shooting a room full of nameless criminals has no impact on us. A hero shooting a room full of criminals with families and loved ones? A hero has to deal with the psychological damage he or she has inflicted on himself and others as well. Not only makes for some very interesting storytelling, it makes for something more true. And so now that I've told you about a few of the core spices to storytelling, get out there and make us a very flavorful meal. If you like what I've produced so far and you like what you're listening to, please like and subscribe to my videos. And if you want to hear more, just click on the videos to see more. In love, light, and laughter, be well.